Gentleman yields back chair, and I recognize Mr. McClellan. Ms. McClellan, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Speaking to the amendment, it is simply a fact that 400 years of slavery and Jim Crow had an impact on communities, particularly African American communities, that manifest themselves today in disparities in health outcomes, that manifest themselves in education that certain communities receive, funding for education and the level of education that they receive. It is a fact that everyone's view of the world is based on their life experience and what they know. And as more people who lived during Jim Crow, including my parents and my aunts and uncles, are dying off, and those stories and the impact are not taught in our schools, the more the impact that didn't go away with a magic wand when the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act were passed, when the military was desegregated, people need to know how policy decisions made during Jim Crow, during an era of white supremacy, still impact people in communities today, particularly if the very communities who were segregated for over 173 years in our armed services, even though the first casualty of the American Civil War was a black man, our armed services were segregated for 173 years. And in many minority communities, they don't view the armed services as a welcoming place.
Well, they're wrong.
And DEI and training on critical race theory helps people who did not grow up learning those stories and those impacts understand how it affects those communities that still feel that impact today. And 2 hours is not a lot of time. Again, that's longer. This committee is going to be multiple times longer than that. If we want an armed services that reflects the full diversity of the country that our members are fighting for to keep safe, then we need to spend some time making sure that everybody understands, particularly in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. But yes, maybe they need to know what critical race theory is. And maybe they need to know why critical race theory was created, to help understand that this country still deals with the impact of over 400 years of slavery and Jim Crow.
Mr. Fallon of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Having been a service member 30 years ago, the Armed Services is absolutely a welcoming place. And if anybody's saying otherwise, the military is a very welcoming place for all Americans. And I think it's funny that people are laughing that didn't even serve. 30 years ago, the military had always led the way on opportunity. And it wasn't perfect when they desegregated, but I find it interesting that in the first Congress I served in a couple years ago, we watched our military be very politicized by standing down incrementally to talk about and teach about extremism in the military. So I asked a very simple question. Was that something that we should have spent, literally, if you look at the opportunity costs, hundreds of millions of dollars on? So I asked the Marine Corps, how many people did you separate based on extremist activities? Of 222,000 active and reserve, it was 4. 4 out of 222,000. The Army, with almost 1 million National Guard reserve and active, it was 9. It was single digits. It wasn't something that was affecting, and jeopardizing our readiness when we're talking about a handful. It was politicizing the military. We had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs say that he wanted to understand white rage while he was in uniform and he's white. That is a political statement. We just had a 3-star general in the Space Force talking about what legislation was being passed at the state level. A political comment in uniform. That is politicizing the military. I don't want Democratic generals and I don't want Republican generals, damn it. I want American generals. And CRT is divisive. You want to talk about history? We should learn about history. CRT is not history. History is talking about the 54th Regiment of Massachusetts, of which I was a native. of Massachusetts, and proud of that. It was made famous by the movie Glory, or the 1 million African Americans that served in World War II and then were denied their opportunities when they came back here. That's history. That's something that we need to talk about and embrace to make sure it never happens again. The fact of the matter is there's many people here in Washington that do not want to acknowledge and believe that racism is a diminishing phenomenon every day in this country. And I was reading your amendment, Mr. Gaetz, and it was a slam dunk. Hell, I thought it might even pass unanimously. How naive, the naivete. It makes complete and perfect sense to acknowledge that the armed services has been at the tip of the spear of inclusion is something that we should all recognize and, quite frankly, celebrate. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. I'll yield my time to Mr. Gaetz.
Yeah, I've heard my colleagues say that we need to learn critical race theory so as to better unify. And I don't think that really reflects a reading of John O. Callamore and Bell Hooks and people who don't present critical race theory as a unifying ideology. Critical race theory is an explicit critique of the civil rights movement. It is a critique of Martin Luther King saying that people write in the principal text of critical race theory that the civil rights movement got it wrong because the civil rights movement sought to have us come together as a nation and live in one country. So this is a separatist ideology. And I want to make clear, we're not trying to limit people's reading or understanding of things. Do that on your own time. But when it comes to the United States military, we should not be teaching people that immutable traits like their race define their destiny. And while there will be further debate on critical race theory and whether or not we should have it at all, I want to get back to the substance of this amendment, which is merely a report on how much we're doing it and what it costs. And the reason that report is so essential is because we have observed in armed services where the top brass sometimes truly doesn't know that some of this pedagogy is ongoing. I had to hold up the What is White Privilege book that was being used at DODOA. And I thank Chairman Banks for consistently bringing in people so that we could confront them with the critical race theory and the odd divisive ideologies that were being presented to our military. So I think you can support critical race theory, though I don't, and still vote for this amendment because it's merely reflecting how much of it is going on. And then if people want to defend that type of divisive conduct, we'll have debates and we'll have votes and hopefully we'll eradicate it. I thank the gentleman for yielding up.